The Handkerchief by Great 78. Chapter 14. Durmstrang, Densaugeo, Dobby, Dinner, and Dance Dates. This Crumb fellow was really making himself quite at home. Not 10 minutes after sitting down at the Slytherin table in the Great Hall, he was staring around the room, commenting about the golden plates and colourful banners, and the girls. "Our castle is dark, is not so much colour and nice things, and our girls not so pretty." Draco looked sideways down the table at the 3 Durmstrang girls, one of whom sported more facial hair than him and Theo combined. The other 2 were attractive in a very severe sort of way, as though they could crush a man with only a hug. Yes, well, we're so pleased to have your school represented here. My father speaks highly of your headmaster," he tried, hoping to change the subject. It was hard enough being a regular, albeit rich, bloke, and sometimes Quidditch match winner at Hogwarts, without an international Quidditch phenom to compete with. Crumb's visage darkened slightly. "Herr Karkaroff is very good. He teaches us well." "I bet he does," thought Draco. Anyone who was friends with Lucius probably had a lot of knowledge to impart. Having been the recipient of that knowledge many times, Draco's teeth were on edge. Damned Potter. Of course it was Potter, that Hufflepuff tosser that all the girls, even the Slytherins, giggled about had made it to the tournament, and yet somehow, despite an age restriction and a Hogwarts champion already having been named, there was Potter. In Transfigurations, he stole a glance over at the Boy Wonder and Hermione, now minus the ginger because apparently loyalty meant nothing to the weasel. She was wearing her usual school robes, but with a pin on her chest. He stood and walked to Professor McGonagall's desk to ask a question, the answer of which he already knew, to have a better look at the pin. Spew. What could it mean? The P was likely Potter, of course. Support Potter? Yes, made sense. E-W. In every way? It had to be. Draco smirked. Looking around, he saw that the only people with the pins besides Hermione were Potter and Longbottom, both of whom had placed them in discreet places on their book bags, so as not to be noticed. Tossers. Draco had an idea. He held his version of the pin out to Hermione, a smirk playing across his face. "Oh, very funny. Really witty," she hissed at him, narrowing her eyes in a knowing look. Quietly she whispered, "What's this about, Malfoy?" "Want one, Granger?" He was careful to emphasize her surname. "I've got loads. But don't touch my hand, now. I've just washed it, you see. Don't want a mudblood sliming it up." The button that he held out to her was surrounded in his hand by a square of white fabric. He turned his head slightly so that no one could see, and winked at her. She rolled her eyes, pursing her lips at the supposed insult, but it had not gone unnoticed by Potter, who immediately jumped to her defense. When their spells collided and ricocheted, hitting Greg and Hermione, Draco was inwardly horrified. He'd meant to hit Potter, and now Hermione was getting the worst of it. He laughed along with the other Slytherins, but was calculating the best way to go and check on her, to confirm that she was all right. After the younger Gryffindor, the one who'd been petrified a couple of years before, had come to collect Potter for some kind of tournament thing, he took his chance. "Sir, my head is hurting a bit. May I go see the nurse?" he asked in his most smarmy voice. Professor Snape stifled a sneer and answered, "Of course, Mr. Malfoy. Do take your things with you." The black eyes pierced his silver ones, and Draco suppressed a shiver. Sometimes Snape gave him the willies. He hurried out, taking a back staircase to the hospital wing. He saw her as she exited, pulling the door closed behind her. He ducked behind a large suit of armor and called her name in a loud whisper as she passed. "We need to stop meeting in the hospital wing," she said, a bit of hurt creeping into her voice. "I'm incredibly sorry. I didn't mean for it to hit you. I just thought it would be funny, is all," he said, but she held out her hand, palm facing him. "Please, leave off the excuses, Draco. I'm just going to try and ignore it from now on. At this point, I know you and Harry and Ron hate each other." She was partly right. Draco hated that Potter had true friends and was universally seen as a good bloke, things that Draco didn't have and might never have. He didn't give much thought about Potter personally. It was more about what he represented. The Weasel, on the other hand, they'd never be friends. He sighed. "I am sorry, Hermione. Pomfrey was able to fix it, then." "Yes," she smiled, and Draco was struck by something. Something seemed different, although he couldn't quite place it. "Well, they came out quite nice. You look good. Different." He inhaled quickly. "Not that you looked bad before." "Thanks very much." She pretended to be wounded, but then smiled. "She went a little further with the shrinking than my original teeth. My parents are dentists and don't subscribe to any magical intervention for my teeth. They'd have preferred to do it the muggle way. It might have taken years, but she fixed them in a few minutes." Hermione huffed. "I suppose I should say thank you, really." "I suppose I should say you're quite welcome, then." He smirked at her. "Prat," she chuckled. "Please, no slapping this time," he asked in a mock, fearful tone. "Well, you did offer pinching as an alternative," she mused, reaching out with her thumbs and forefingers with pincer grips, a playful smile flitting across her face. He instinctively protected his ribs by grabbing her forearms as she reached for him, their laughter carrying a little too loud down the hallway. She had just touched his ribs with her fingertips when voices filtered down to them from the next corridor. Draco could make out the boom of Ludo Bagman, the rumble of Dumbledore as they grew nearer, then retreated as the group made their way down the staircase to the great hall. He grasped her elbows to hold her close, out of sight of the crowd down the hall. Their eyes met, and the laughter died away. His eyes involuntarily slipped down to her lips, which she licked nervously. "I should go get ready for dinner. Harry will be looking for me," she said, sounding a bit reluctant. "All right. Oh, you forgot this. The other night." He reached into his robe pocket, then pressed the handkerchief into her hand. She smiled and palmed it, turning to go down the hall where the voices had been moments before. Just before she turned the corner, she stopped, looking down at her hand holding the fabric. Opening it curiously, she suddenly gasped audibly enough that Draco could hear it. He smiled, knowing what had caught her attention. It was one of his Potter Stinks badges, but he'd charmed the other side differently from the others. Instead of reading "Support Cedric Diggory, the real Hogwarts champion," this one read, "But Hermione Granger smells lovely, actually." Hermione visibly scoffed, making Draco chuckle. He watched as she dropped the pin in her bag and tucked the handkerchief in her sleeve. Apparently, spew had nothing to do with Potter. Hermione had created some kind of misguided group trying to liberate the house elves. It made Draco laugh internally every time he thought about it. Draco had once asked Pym if he wanted to be free, and Pym had given him the silent treatment for hours. Surely there were some elves who would enjoy freedom. His father had terrorized more than his fair share of house elves over the years, but most of them were quite happy, it seemed. He'd spotted Hermione one evening before dinner, lurking around the downstairs corridors, inspecting the paintings, checking to ensure the coast was clear of nosy Slytherins and high-minded Gryffindors. He snuck up on her, grabbing the tail of her blouse sticking out from under her jumper, and tugged. She whirled around, her burnished copper eyes alight, and for a brief moment he thought she might hex his bollocks off, but she lowered her wand with a smile when she saw that it was him. "Looking for me, Hermione?" He gave her what he hoped was a daring look. "Need me to confirm what Rita Skeeter was saying about you? You are a wee bit stunningly pretty, you know. Just a bit." She blushed a fierce pink. "Sod off about it." But her smile gave her away. "I'm actually looking for the kitchens. The entrance is supposed to be near here." "All right, it's just around here." He led her a few paintings down to a bowl of fruit. "Why are you going to the kitchens?" She explained about Spew and how she was hoping to free the elves who worked at Hogwarts. "I understand where you're coming from, Hermione, but you may have a tough time convincing them. Elves enjoy the work they do." "I'm not saying they shouldn't enjoy the work. They should just get a fair wage for it, is all." She grew more animated as she talked. "If I can only talk to them—" "Oh, but by all means, let's go." Draco turned, smoothly tucking her hand beneath and around his own crooked elbow, as though he were about to escort her to a gala. Reaching out, he tickled the appropriate pair, adding, "The Hogwarts motto says to never tickle a sleeping dragon. It says nothing about pears." Hermione rolled her eyes exasperatedly. The paintings swung open, and they were instantly welcomed into the kitchen, as though they were seafarers returning after being thought lost at sea. They were seated next to the hearth, in plush chairs. Elves bowed, offering them tea, biscuits, pumpkin juice, slices of the orange cake that everyone else was about to enjoy at dinner, even a full dinner platter of lamb chops with mint jelly. Towards the far end of the kitchen, hanging back as though afraid to approach, stood an elf who looked vaguely familiar to Draco. He knew by sight the handful of elves who worked in the Slytherin dormitories, and this was not one. Furthermore, whilst the other elves wore crisp white tea towels with the Hogwarts emblem, this elf wore a necktie and football shorts, mismatched socks, and was that a woolly bladder on its head? Tentatively, the elf approached. Master Draco, sir." Suddenly, the cowed expression and giant green eyes popped into place in his memory. "Are you Dobby, Dotty? My father's house elf?" "I is Dobby, sir, but I is no longer working for Master Malfoy, sir. Dobby is a free elf." Hermione let out an excited gasp. "Dobby! It's lovely to finally meet you," she cried. Draco was struck dumb momentarily. This whole meeting seemed extraordinary, and he wasn't sure which seemed more strange, that Hermione knew this elf of all elves, or that Lucius had set an elf free. "How did that happen?" he asked, perplexed. Dobby proceeded to tell the tale, how he had snuck away to warn of evil-doing before the Chamber of Secrets was opened, how he had tried to keep everyone safe, but no one would listen, and how the great wizard Harry Potter had freed him by making Master Malfoy give Dobby a sock. "This is Master Harry's sock, and Dobby is finding all kinds of new clothes in the waste bins, and Dobby is saving his wages to buy a new jumper for winter. Dobby owes everything to Master Harry. He is truly a great wizard." Draco's mind was blank with shock. He thought back to the summer after second year. Now that he thought more about it, Lucius had been even more incensed than usual for a while, constantly calling various house elves to perform tasks, and never being happy about the results. At the time, Draco hadn't thought much about it, but now it all made so much more sense. And, of course, it had to do with Boy Wonder. Hermione was asking more questions, but Draco was lost in thought. Here was this elf, abused by his father, free. Despite his waste-bin clothes and meager wages, Draco almost envied him. Somehow, he had defied Lucius and gotten away. Out of the corner of his eye, Draco noticed a small table appearing to float towards them, with 2 heaping plates of food on them. It settled between them, and a small elf stepped from underneath it, smiling up at Draco. "You is Pym's master?" she inquired timidly. "Yes, Pym is my friend, my elf, and my friend," he added hastily as he felt Hermione's eyes turn to him. "Pym is Folly's grandfather. Pym is a kind grandfather to Folly. Pym brings sweets to Folly's birthday every year." It was surprisingly painful to Draco to learn that his beloved Pym not only had a family, but that Draco had had no idea. Pym had been married, had had children and grandchildren. Draco had no idea. He felt like he'd learned more about house elves in the last 5 minutes than he had in his last 14 years. Folly and Dobby were now encouraging them to eat, ignoring Hermione's request for them to pull up chairs and eat as well. Draco smiled across the table and picked up a fork and knife. He cut into the lamb, dipping it lightly in the mint jelly and popping it in his mouth, but not before saying, "Let's not let it get cold, Hermione. They'll be disappointed if we don't eat." They ate for a moment in uncertain silence, and Draco realized that this was the first time they'd eaten together since Christmas their 2nd year, and the first time they'd eaten together alone. He had watched her eat, of course, had seen her picking at meals whilst distracted in their 1st and 2nd years, eating quickly during 3rd and 4th years. He had witnessed her looks of disgust at the weasel's slovenly table manners, and laughed at her revulsion. He'd seen her whispering and laughing with some of the other girls at the Gryffindor table, offering comfort to Potter occasionally, even speaking encouragingly to Neville at times. He had marveled at her ability to know what everyone needed, and when they needed it. Every once in a while, their eyes had met. In early years, Draco had looked away quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring, but in the last year or so, that had changed. Now that Draco understood why he had been staring, it still surprised him to see her looking back at him from across the great hall so often, and pleased him to see her sometimes offer a small smile to him, as if she understood that he had needed it. "Thank you for showing me how to get into the kitchens," she said suddenly. "I know the idea of freedom is a foreign concept to these elves, but many of them don't know how some house elves are treated. This summer we saw one treated badly at the World Cup. The loyalty she showed, it meant nothing to her master. She was heartbroken." "I'm surprised to find Dobby here. A Malfoy elf is never released from service, and my father is probably not the best master." Draco said this last bit to his plate, too embarrassed to meet her eyes. Hermione knew so much about his father, and yet, still, she only knew a sliver of the truth. "Let's talk about something more pleasant. I'd love to hear about your friend, Pym." Her copper eyes danced. For the next 30 minutes, Draco regaled her with stories of his childhood, of Pym and Tiffy and Eustace and the other elves at Malfoy Manor. As he talked, Draco realized that when he thought of his childhood, the elves were a constant presence, even more constant than his own parents. If he truly thought about it, he probably missed the house elves as much as he missed Narcissa, and certainly more than Lucius. This realization hit him like a ton of bricks, and he was surprised to find himself verbalizing it to Hermione. She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it. "I'm sorry that things were not the best for you, growing up. I know that you're under a lot of pressure, what with being the sole heir of such a well-known family. I know they expect a lot of you, maybe too much." He took in a ragged breath, willing himself to calm down. He had had these thoughts in his own mind for some time, but to hear them spoken by someone that, in truth, he barely knew in the grand scheme of things, was eye-opening. If someone outside of the family was able to see the pressure he was under, why did his parents continue to apply it? He squeezed her fingers, bringing them gently to his cheek. They were soft yet firm as they gripped his hand. His silver eyes met hers, the copper now a deeper, warmer shade in the firelight. He did not trust himself to speak, only brought her fingers to his lips, kissing them softly. "I'm not telling you. You'll just make fun of me." Hermione was speaking with the weasel, who just asked her with whom she was attending Yule Ball. Draco picked up his pace, wanting to join this conversation. Ever since the ball had been announced, he'd fallen asleep to those old thoughts from his parents' New Year's gala, of him dancing with Hermione, whereas once he'd felt almost disturbed by the idea. Now he found he quite fancied it. Surely the witch didn't already have a date. He knew that it would be nearly impossible for them to go together, considering who they were, but the idea had taken hold in his mind, and he found it hard to shake loose. Perhaps they would be the last two in their year without dates, and Theo or Greg would mention it casually in class, perhaps dare him to ask her in front of the entire class, and who was he to turn down a dare? "You're joking, Weasley. You're not telling me that someone's already asked that to the ball? Not the long-moled mudblood?" Hermione gave him a sharp look with a knowing narrowing of her eyes, followed by the smallest of sly smiles. She raised her hand to her chin, offering him a middle-fingered salute. It took Draco everything not to laugh. Then she said, "Hello, Professor Moody." As Draco startled, looking back behind himself, he heard Hermione giggle and say, "Twitchy little ferret, aren't you, Malfoy?" That insidious minx. He would need to congratulate her for getting him with that one tonight in his note. After their impromptu dinner together in the kitchens, Draco had sent her a note, thanking her for the dinner together, adding that it was one of his favorite meals in a long time, but that he would be certain not to mention this to Tiffy when he saw her next. She had replied that she enjoyed it too, and proceeded to tell him about Winky, the house elf who had been treated so badly at the World Cup, and how she now worked at Hogwarts as well, and that if he crossed the line too often with his teasing, she'd get Winky and Dobby to stop by and visit Tiffy, to tell her what he said. Over the next few weeks, they'd exchange short notes, then longer ones. At first it was every few days, but now it was nearly nightly, delivered by either Draco's eagle owl, Thorn, or a brown school owl. Draco did not know if Hermione talked about the delivery of letters with her dorm mates, but Draco had had to deflect questions from his mates on several occasions. Too often, Draco found himself apologizing in these notes for something mean that he'd said, either to her or to her friends. He knew that regardless of the way she accepted his apologies, even joked with him about the things he'd said, they had to take their toll. He could tell her with his words that he didn't believe those things he said, all he wanted, but actions often spoke louder. It made him frustrated to have to keep apologizing, afraid that the next time she would no longer accept it. But his weekly calls with his father and mother had never gone as well. Narcissa read the gossip magazines and seemed to have collected the tidbits about Potter, and by extension Hermione, to share with Lucius and Draco. It pleased Lucius to hear Potter taken down a peg, and it seemed that Draco's input of, "Huh," or "Really?" was enough to satiate his parents. Draco knew that his housemates likewise would comment to their parents that Draco was in line with the pureblood way of thinking. He'd overheard Augustus Travers, a mousy sixth-year, laughing with his father about Draco's "Potter stinks" pins, and Pansy recounting mirthfully the story of his deflected tooth-growing curse to her godfather, an angular, sharp-jawed man that she referred to as Uncle Corbin. He knew his parents attended events with those people, and undoubtedly they'd had conversations. It was stressful, at times, leading a sort of double life like this, but in truth Draco didn't know another way to live. He felt like he'd been living a double life ever since he came to Hogwarts. Maybe even before then. That night he wrote to Hermione, giving her credit for scaring him with the Professor Moody tactic, and apologizing for calling her what he had. He asked with whom she was going to the dance, but when her reply returned an hour or so later, it only said that she understood, but it was still hard to hear sometimes. There was no mention of her date to the dance. Draco sighed. If she wouldn't tell her best friends, he should have known she wouldn't tell him. Still, the idea that she would have her arms around some other bloke, smiling and dancing with him, it rankled his nerves. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Handkerchief by Great78.